I'm delighted to welcome Scott Jasper, who is a lecturer in the National Security Affairs Department at the US Naval Postgraduate School and the author of Russian Cyber Operations, which was published last month, I'm very proud to say, by GU Press, and will form the basis of our conversation today. So thank you so much for being here, Scott.
Al, thanks a lot for the kind introduction. It's quite a pleasure to be here with you and to discuss this very important topic.
Thank you. So I thought we'd start with the thesis of your book, which is that Russia wants to reclaim a spot as one of the world's 2 or 3 most important powers. And in many ways, it's operating from a position of weakness. So, for example, its economy is dependent on oil and not that strong. And so it uses asymmetric strategies, including cyber operations. So to get us started, can you define what you mean by cyber operations and describe some of the most common techniques?
Sure. When we look at the definition of cyber operations in joint doctrine, it is the employment of cyberspace capabilities where the primary purpose is to achieve objectives in and through cyberspace. Russia uses cyberspace operations to achieve political and military objectives. So their most common attack vectors, or what we would call methods for intrusion, are, as you imagine, spear phishing, credential theft, and posting of water holes. So, for example, the last category, when you look at the 2017 Bad Rabbit attack, visitors to Russian language media websites were shown a pop-up that said to update their Flash player system. When they clicked on that, malware was downloaded into their system. The Russians also use sophisticated techniques, such as the use of fileless malware. And what that means is that malware is not loaded to the disk, where it can be scanned. Instead, it operates in memory. So the Russians use legitimate processes, tools, and so forth, such as Microsoft macros, PowerShell, and so forth, to execute those sort of attacks. And lastly, for deception, the Russians attempt to mislead, misdirect, and misattribute. For example, during the 2018 Winter Olympics, the Russian hackers from the GRU, the main intelligence directorate, used North Korean IP addresses to make the attack look like the work of North Korean hackers. The Russians also employ proxies, we'll talk about today, to divert or take the blame. Those are normally found in patriotic or nationalist hackers, criminal organizations, and events persistent threat groups.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful context for the rest of the conversation. I think many of us became aware of this issue either during or probably after the 2016 election. But your book shows that that this was not the start, of course. And so I was wondering if you could talk us through some of the most important Russian cyber operations before that, and particularly those involving Ukraine.
Sure. So Russian cyber operations started from a visible perspective in 2007 during the protests in Tallinn in Estonia over the movement of a Soviet war memorial from the city center to a cemetery. There were a series of attacks, which was somewhat an act of coercion that I talk about in the book. Also, a year later in 2008, in the Georgian incursion or invasion, Russia used cyber operations. The challenge of both those situations was that the evidence actually fell upon patriotic hackers, as I stated earlier, using instructions from Russian forums and malware, and also upon criminal organizations, using primarily bots, large collections of computers to overwhelm systems. In both cases, there was no actual clear evidence to a state. So you could think that Russia did this. However, it could not necessarily be proven, especially at the time. There's no doubt that Ukraine is a primary target. Russia has clear objectives in regards to Ukraine and using cyber to achieve those per the definition I gave you. So Russia wants to maintain long-term influence over Kiev. It wants to frustrate attempts to integrate into Western institutions. And it's going to use cyber operations then to weaken the nation economically, politically, and so forth. There's a couple significant examples that can be given that brought more attention to this. And that was in 2015, in December, there were attacks upon, in Ukraine, 3 energy companies the day before or so before Christmas. Those knocked out power to actually 225,000 customers. In this case here, the Russians had used black energy malware, using actually macros that I said before to install that, and then work their way to control systems at substations for turning off power. The other big one would be the NotPetya attack in 2017 that looked like a ransomware attack. In fact, on national media, I was in Washington, D.C. doing meetings and conferences, and I saw that on TV back in my hotel room. Ransomware attack strikes Europe. Actually, it was another Russian attack that looked like ransomware. It was a mock attack that had the same effect of destroying systems. But in this case, it wasn't looking to collect the ransom. It was looking to inflict punishment upon Ukraine, primarily as a target. So there's a lot of other examples. We do cover those in the book. I'll try to bring a few more into discussion.
Great. Thank you so much. So, we could do a whole series of podcasts about the 2016 election and Russian interference, and people have, of course. But I think, it's important for us to talk about it. And I'd be interested in your view of what Russia was trying to achieve in that election and whether they succeeded on their own terms.
Well, there have been quite a number of assessments of what they did through investigations. And one of the earlier ones was in January 2017, right after the election. The intelligence community gave their assessment. And they said the goals were to undermine faith in the US democratic process, but mostly to denigrate Secretary Clinton, harm her. Okay? So when you look at the activity that you saw, the hacks, the leaks, the social media posts, the mass media on Russian state-sponsored television, a lot of it was trying to depict Secretary Clinton as being very weak, fragile, and unable to lead. And also, it tried to attempted to portray her from a corrupt perspective. As I look at some of the releases, one that really caught my eye was on Russia Today RT, a video that said how 100% of the Clintons' 2015 charity went to themselves. And as you can imagine, there's been a lot of discussion about the Clinton Foundation and the purpose of it and where the money went. And Russia would play upon those sort of things. But more so than just Russia Today, which was broadcast in Russia and also all around the world, by the way, you can watch it here in the United States if you choose, was also rebroadcast, for example, on Facebook. It had 10 million views. So you almost saw some working together of the state-based entities to promote that. So the question, what did it achieve? Well, the Mueller investigation came back and they said that the GRU, the hacking, did not alter the outcome or alter the vote. That's because you have to change the mind of the voter. How do you measure that? How do you capture that? Maybe you could do polls or surveys, but in reality, all we know is who won and who didn't. But what we do know is that if one of the goals was to politically divide the country, when we look at the political scene today, I would believe Russia achieved that as a long-term effect, probably more so than Putin ever imagined.
Right. Thank you. So as a follow-up, do we know what Russia is doing in the current campaign? Has its techniques or technologies evolved in the meantime?
Well, there are some indications that the hack and leak will continue to be attempted. Okay, so in January 2020, a few months ago, 4 or 5 months ago or so, it was revealed that GRU hackers had attempted to break into Burisma, the oil and gas company where Hunter Biden, the son of course, Vice President, the candidate Joe Biden, worked as a board member. They were using techniques, phishing, and attempts to get credentials, common again, as I said, that Russia does. You would imagine that they were trying to drag up dirt on Hunter Biden that could discredit his dad, all right? They didn't quite get to the point where we've seen those leaks like we saw in 2016. Now, as far as some of the techniques, an article that I found was fascinating was on Facebook, how they had discovered Russia was changing some of their methods when you talk about tactics, as far as some of the social posts. So in 2016, there was a lot of new personas, new organizations that look real. The GOP in Tennessee had logos and so forth, and you thought it was real, you were following it or something. Well, now what they're doing is they're impersonating actual real organizations, not making them up, trying to use the legitimacy. So it's going to be very difficult then for some of the organizations to take those offline, but there might not be as many. We'll see. I think what you're seeing today is sleepers. In other words, these are not going to be very visible until close to the election.
Right.
Then you'll see more predominant voices pushing the same sort of decisive issues, whether it be migration, race, religion, gun rights. We'll probably see that maybe September or so, stoking discord in the country.
Yeah, thank you.
That's the come.
So I know your book was written before the pandemic, but is Russia peddling misinformation about COVID-19 in Western countries? And if so, what are they trying to achieve by doing that?
Yeah, Russia was pushing those theories all the way back in January, okay? And they were using state, like Ministry of Defense channels, and they were using through their social media connections, outlets around the world. Their favorite topic, which was repeated, is that the virus is made by the US, and it's made in laboratories such as in Ukraine or in Georgia. They also likewise said it was made by NATO, okay, in NATO labs. So trying to discredit NATO and the West is their goal. But they also were spreading other sorts of message of hysteria, saying, for example, that it spread on race. If you were of a certain race, you would have a higher chance of getting the virus. And to be honest, if you look at some of the states, there is a higher percentage upon different racial backgrounds. So and sometimes Russia will push these themes and they'll amplify messages. They give more alternatives to truth that could have some merit, but they're pushing that in a disinformation manner. So they're trying to raise some fear, maybe fear upon communities, like in that case there. You're at a higher risk of getting the virus. They're also pushing other sort of conspiracies, like, for example, if you were in Italy or in Spain and you were getting a test, you were actually getting the virus, okay, at the same time. So therefore, some of our NATO allies, they would raise concern in those countries. So Russia has been very active in this area, yes.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier an attack on Ukraine's infrastructure, its power grid. Are those kind of threats, when we think of the US, are they real? Could Russia disable our power grid? Is that something we should be worried about?
Oh, they're very real. And in the book, I use a signature attack that I also use in my classes to demonstrate the ability of Russia. And I use it in a few places and looking at the technical complexity of the Russian actors, the type of tactics they used that were basically unbeatable. And we'll get the resilience, I hope, later in the discussion. But what the evidence is, both our Treasury Department and our US CERT released that as early as 2016, Russian hackers were attempting to penetrate US sectors, in particular energy. And they were going after third-party vendors, such as small companies that have a relationship with, say, a utility. They would penetrate those, and then they could send an email message from, say, that third-party company to the utility, and they think it's real. The Russians have done this a lot. They penetrated, for example, our State Department to send a message to the White House or something of that nature, or the Pentagon. So they do this. And what they would attempt to do is then break into utility with some ingenious tactics. And once they got in, they would use these legitimate processes like PowerShell, these Microsoft tools, PSSec, WMI, and so forth, to move across using scripts. Very hard to detect. And what they did is they got actually all the way to the point, according to DHS, where they could throw switches and disrupt power supplies. That's scary. And they did this in at least 24 utilities. And the charts that DHS showed, although the names were not there, included nuclear power plants. So I think the threat is very real. The question is, of course, how many utilities could they get to, and how much of a cascading effect could they create if they attacked us or use that?
Right. Thank you. So all of this is very scary and raises the question of how we respond. So your book describes a number of different avenues that Western countries have pursued. But I was wondering if you could start with describing some of the kind of non-technological responses the US has tried.
Well, we have pushed back on the Russians in various ways, using primarily what is termed a name and shame strategy. The State Department leads that in some of our declarations. As early as the 2016 elections, President Obama signed a package of punitive measures after, again, the intelligence community in as early as October blamed the attack on Russia. Okay. And that package of measures included sanctions, expulsions, and closures of compounds. And the sanctions went after the GRU primarily, and they were trying to implement targeted bans on travel, assets, and so forth. But in reality, they were pretty symbolic, the early ones we did. The other measures, the closing of compounds, were a couple of recreational compounds on Maryland's Eastern Shore and on Long Island, considered to be summer homes for Russian diplomats. We also expelled something like 35 intelligence operatives that were in Washington and also in San Francisco. And we gave them and their families only 72 hours to leave the country. That's pretty staunch, I would say. But in reality, some of those measures were also being considered because at the same time, there was a lot of harassment of our diplomats in Moscow. So there was word that we were preparing those type measures. So in some ways, those were watered down. Now, we've continued to use sanctions, indictments, and I think a very significant use of sanctions that didn't get a lot of publicity was in April 2018. What we did is we sanctioned 7 Russian oligarchs, 12 companies for their role in malicious cyber activities. So we went after some of Putin's inner circle, the elites, tried to change their mind on supporting this type of behavior. But what we found was that it, of course, in some ways harmed Western interests. So, for example, one of the oligarchs, one of his companies was Rusal. If you're familiar, they produce aluminum, the second largest producer in the world, and a lot of their outlets around the world suffered because, of course, what happened is the price went skyrocketed. So the Trump administration pushed back and took those off, which the Republicans supported, the Democratic Congress pushed back, but yet we took off the sanctions. So I found fascinating as I study Russia, President Putin, in one of his interviews, like a 4-hour interview, said explicitly that the methods of pressure, I'll quote, used by other countries are ineffective, counterproductive, and harmful to all. In that case, he demonstrated that. So some of those measures are intended to be meaningful. I support them wholeheartedly in the whole government approach, but yet there are limits.
Right. Thank you. So we have a question from a participant that I'd like you to address, which is, to what extent does the U.S. coordinate with NATO and non-NATO allies in dealing with the threats that we're discussing?
Oh, I think an easy answer there goes back to the name and shame campaign. So what we've seen is that normally when in the past, like in the election, maybe the United States went in alone, right? 2016, we claim Russia did it, all right? But now what we're seeing is other sorts of attacks, for example, NotPetya, other allies, especially our Five Eyes allies like the UK, will also make declarations that Russia is behind this. So these are joint statements. The most recent case of that was actually in October 2019, 9 months ago. The GRU attacked the Republic of Georgia once again. taking a number of websites and outlets, including television outlets, offline. Well, it's something like 12 nations blame the attack on Russia. So what we're seeing is more of a coordinated effort to call out Russia for doing their actions. So I think there is cooperation now amongst countries, okay, in the West in particular.
Great, thank you. So can you tell us how Russia exploits legal regimes to avoid more powerful responses from the US and other countries?
Right. So the most significant of legal regimes is when you look at what constitutes an armed attack. And that, under the Charter of the United Nations, Article 51, gives a state the inherent right to use force in self-defense. So that could be military force, okay? So what are the thresholds then for an armed attack? And how do you establish that in cyberspace? So there's been various efforts to do that, and one of the most significant is the NATO CCD COE in Tallinn, the same place that the attack occurred in 2007. An outcome of that was to establish that center, has sponsored the development of the Tallinn Manual to guide legal interpretations. And the experts that wrote the Tallinn Manual talked about the scale and effects of an attack and how that could relate to an armed attack. And they talked about things like seriously injuring or killing a number of persons or causing significant damage, destruction of property. Okay, that could reach a scale and effects. But the challenge that Russia plays upon is that ambiguity. So even though you have what seems to be defined criteria, the question is, how do you capture what is serious or what is significant? How much does it take to get to that level? And this is where Russia can play against the rules and do their operations.
Thank you. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what technical or technological responses the US and other countries engage in, and whether these are strictly defensive or whether we engage in kind of offensive responses as well.
Well, sure. The answer there is that, so I gave you that threshold of an armed attack, and below that, there is a threshold of what's called an internationally wrongful act. And a lot of what we're seeing with Russia are violations of sovereignty, prohibitions and interference, which is one of the conditions of that. The second condition is to have attribution to a state in order to respond with what are called countermeasures. So those countermeasures can be cyber in nature, which means they could be not more forceful, but not necessarily use of force, as defined in international law. So there are challenges in establishing, again, the qualification of the violation and the attribution. But that does give nations some capability to respond. The key there is that those are supposed to be temporary, almost reversible. So doing things like a DDoS attack to get them to knock it off, okay, would be them being the bad guys, the bad actors, would be in that category, okay, where you launch something against their servers. So, you can maybe make the interpretation that what Cyber Command did during the midterm election, where we took the IRA servers offline, could be following in that, a violation that the United States is preemptively or taking them offline. So we could go more into details on that if you'd like.
No, that's great. Thank you. That's very helpful. So we have about 5 minutes left, so I hope we can get to a few more questions. But I want to ask you, your book describes this idea of cyber resilience, that's what we need to develop. And I know that's a key notion. So I wonder if you could talk about that, how we build resilience in response to these threats.
Right. So what we're looking at there is that if you look at, for example, our 2018 National Cyber Strategy, we talk about the need for security and resilience in that. And in this case here, when you think about security, you're more thinking about preventing an attack. Where you think about resilience, you're talking about withstanding an attack. So I use a lot of the last third of the book to talk about solutions, using a company, Palo Alto Networks, that the Naval Postgraduate School has their systems installed here. So I'm familiar with those systems. And I look at how data correlation technologies can be used in various aspects of detection, investigation, and response. And how can I defeat the actor, in particular, once they break in? So the Russians are very sophisticated, as I've stated. They're also very fast. When you look at some attacks like NotPetya, they were literally working in minutes or seconds to encrypt large organizations. So, and they break out across the network. CrowdStrike is set in 18 minutes. So we need technologies to detect these very subtle attacks, these processes, and then we need to be able to react with automated defenses very quickly before human intervention in some cases. So the resilience idea is establishing these robust solutions for preventing, not just preventing, but also withstanding the attack.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one final question, and this one's really a little bit more about how the US and Russia, I guess, kind of organize themselves in terms of cyber operations. So this is a question from a participant that we've had 25 years to kind of think about these issues, and that in the US, we're still kind of have overlapping and ill-defined authorities and missions. So I wanted to ask you how well the Russians have done in defining roles and missions, and whether there are limits on Putin's own power to conduct cyber operations.
Right. Well, you have to start with just some terms there. So the United States, we're talking about cyber operations, and it's common for us to think in the term cyber or cyber warfare. But in reality, Russia doesn't use that sort of terminology. If they have interpretations in their language for that, that's usually talking about a translation of, say, Western actions. Russia conceptualizes cyber operations inside information warfare, is what they do. And they use the idea that information warfare seeks to steal, plan, interdict, manipulate, distort, destroy information. And some of the examples I've been giving you, they do that. They don't really see a difference between peace and war today with the West, especially in the information domain. Okay, so they're engaged in full-scale information warfare right now. And some of the reports, like, for example, our congressional reports say that. They say that Russia engaged in information warfare, okay, in the 2016 election. So as far as roles and missions, well, I've been talking about some of those actors. You know, we have actors like Sandworm, who did the NotPetya and the 2015 attacks, and they're affiliated with the GRU, the Russian Main Intelligence Directorate. But we also have the FSB, Russian Federal Security Service. They're also doing cyber activity. They were the other actor in the 2016 election hack, Cozy Bear, okay, APT-29. But the key was it didn't even look like they were working together. They looked like they were both in the DNC networks, okay, trying to get dirt on Trump and Clinton, all right? So we have maybe some delineation and responsibility, but the question is the roles maybe are overlapping. Same thing in critical infrastructure, okay? Who's doing what? Going back to the idea that the hacks in the US were the FSB, while again, GRU with Sandworm was the critical infrastructure in Ukraine. So we don't really know the difference here. But what we do know is that Russia doesn't seem to have a lot of limits, okay? We have not succeeded in convincing Russian actors that there'll be consequences that are significant or meaningful for their actions, okay? And we also haven't convinced them that they're going to fail. They're very good, all right? And so I would say, are there limits? Well, maybe the limits are somewhere below that threshold of an armed attack. But what we're seeing today is more in those other categories, and there's nothing holding them back, it seems.
Well, thank you. I think we're going to have to end on that somber note, although obviously we could continue this conversation for some time. But I want to thank you for being here. This has been a fascinating discussion.
Well, I'd like to thank you. And if I have one last moment on your audience, I'd also like to thank General Alexander, the United States Army, retired, the first commander of U.S. Cyber Command, former director of the National Security agency for writing the foreword of the book. That was very gracious. I know he's very much in demand, and I very much appreciate him expressing his opinions on this. And I also hope some of your listeners can stay in touch. For example, on Twitter, I'm at Scott Jasper, SCOT1T, Jasper, JSPER. So I'd love to see some of your listeners follow back and keep this communication going. Keep this discussion. It's so important. And I'll learn from them. And again, my thanks to General Alexander. I just did not want to lose that opportunity to thank him.
No, absolutely.
So special for me.
We couldn't agree more, of course, about that. And want to thank you again. And I love the idea of continuing the conversation by other means. So I just wanted to say to everyone that we're going to take next week off for the 4th of July holiday, and then we'll return the following week, July 9th, with Daniel Submazzi, who is a Georgetown University professor and director of the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, and he'll be talking about medical ethics in a time of crisis. So I hope you can join us for that, and thank you again, Scott, and thank you, everyone. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you again for the pleasure. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.